In the autumn of 1274, the most powerful army the world had ever seen sailed toward a small chain of islands at the edge of the map. They had crushed China. They had burned Baghdad. They had ridden from the steppes of Mongolia all the way to the gates of Europe, and not one kingdom, not one empire had been able to stop them. 900 ships, 40,000 soldiers, commanded in the name of Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, the man who ruled more of the earth than any human being before him. And they were coming for Japan. The Japanese had no idea what was about to hit them. They had never faced an enemy like this. They had never seen weapons like this. By every measure that mattered, numbers, technology, experience, sheer terror, the samurai should have been wiped off the face of history. But something happened on that beach in Hakata Bay that the Mongols never wrote down in their official records. Something they only whispered about when they got home, because the soldiers who survived came back with a story. A story about a single warrior in pale armor who walked through their arrows like they were rain. A man who should have died a dozen times and simply would not fall. They didn't call him a samurai. They called him a demon. Here is what makes this so hard to believe. At that exact moment in history, no force on earth had a record like the Mongols. They had toppled the largest empires of the age one after another. Kings paid them tribute just to be left alone. Whole cities surrendered at the mere rumor that they were coming, because the alternative was annihilation. The smart move, the only move by any sane calculation, was to bow. And the Japanese, looking at the same odds everyone else had looked at, made the opposite choice. They decided they would rather be destroyed than ruled. This is the true story of the day the most unstoppable empire in human history met something it could not conquer, and how the fate of an entire nation came down to one beach, one storm, and one warrior who refused to die. Stay with me to the end, because what saved Japan that day is something historians still argue about 800 years later, and it changed how the Japanese saw themselves forever. It even echoes in events happening in our world right now. Let's go back. To understand why the samurai were so afraid, you have to understand who was coming. In the year 1206, a man named Temujin united the warring tribes of the Mongolian steppe and took a new name, Genghis Khan, universal ruler. Over the next decades, he and his sons built the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever known, stretching from the Pacific Ocean all the way to the edge of Eastern Europe. They conquered the Jin dynasty in northern China. They swallowed the kingdoms of Central Asia. They left cities of 1 million people as smoking ruins. And they did it with a speed and a brutality that seemed almost supernatural to the people in their path. By the 1260 seconds, Genghis was long dead. But his grandson, Kublai Khan, had taken the empire to a new height. Kublai turned his attention south and east, completing the conquest of China and founding the Yuan dynasty, declaring himself emperor not just of the steppe, but of the ancient civilization he had subdued. He sat at the center of the known world, and from that center, he looked out across the sea toward a string of islands he had heard whispered about by Korean and Chinese traders. Japan. They called it the land of the rising sun. A wealthy place, they said, sophisticated, proud, and, crucially, not yet bowing to him. For a man who believed it was his heaven-granted destiny to rule everything under the sky, that was intolerable. So Kublai did what conquerors always do first. He sent a letter. Beginning in 1266, Mongol envoys arrived in Japan carrying a message addressed to the king of a small country. The tone was polite on the surface and unmistakable underneath. Submit. Send tribute. Acknowledge the Khan as your sovereign, or prepare for war. Nobody would wish to resort to arms, the letter said, in the way that a man holding a sword says it. The letter eventually reached Kamakura, the seat of Japan's real power. Because here is the first thing most people don't realize. In the 13th century, the Emperor of Japan didn't actually run the country. He was a sacred figure, a living link to the gods, kept in the old capital of Kyoto. The real military government, the shogunate, was based in the city of Kamakura, and it was run by a clan called the Hojo, who held the title of regent. And the man who would have to decide how Japan answered the most dangerous man alive was barely a man at all. His name was Hojo Tokimune. He was a teenager when the threat began to loom, and he would become regent at just 18 years old. 18, facing Kublai Khan. Tokimune read the Mongol demands, and then he did something that, by the cold logic of power, was almost insane. He said nothing. He refused to even reply. He sent the envoys home without an answer, and he ordered the defenses of Kyushu, the island closest to the Asian mainland, to be strengthened. To the young regent and his samurai advisors, the very idea of bowing to a foreign ruler was a stain that could never be washed out. Death before dishonor was not a poster slogan to these men. It was the operating system of their entire culture. But understand what that refusal meant. Tokimune had just told the conqueror of the world to get lost. And the conqueror of the world was not a man who let insults slide. In the courts of Kublai Khan, the decision was made. If Japan would not kneel, Japan would be broken. The shipyards of conquered Korea were ordered to begin building thousands of vessels. The forests of the peninsula were stripped bare. Korean laborers were worked to exhaustion and beyond, dying by the thousands, to build a fleet for a war that wasn't even theirs. Soldiers were gathered, Mongols, Chinese, Koreans, Jurchens, a multinational army assembled under Mongol command for a single purpose: to cross the sea and erase Japanese independence forever. By the autumn of 1274, the fleet was ready, and on the islands of Japan, the samurai sharpened their swords, said their prayers, and watched the western horizon. They were about to discover that everything they knew about war was about to be turned upside down. In November of 1274, the fleet sailed. Somewhere between 500 and 900 ships pushed out from Korea, carrying an army of perhaps 30 to 40,000 fighting men. They did not sail straight for the mainland of Japan. They were too clever for that. First, they would take the stepping stones, the smaller islands that lay between the continent and Kyushu. The first was Tsushima. Tsushima was defended by a local lord named So Sukekuni and a tiny force of samurai, by some accounts fewer than 100 mounted men. When the Mongol fleet appeared on the horizon blackening the sea, Sukekuni did not flee. He did not surrender. He rode out to meet an army hundreds of times his size, because that was what a samurai did. What happened on Tsushima was a massacre. The samurai fought according to the traditions of their warrior code, and here is where Japan's terrible disadvantage first revealed itself. The samurai of the 13th century fought as individuals. It was a ritual of honor. A samurai would ride forward, announce his name, his lineage, the great deeds of his ancestors, and challenge a worthy opponent to single combat. War, to them, was a contest of personal glory between noble warriors. The Mongols had no idea what these men were doing, and they did not care. As a samurai sat on his horse proclaiming his bloodline, the Mongols simply shot him full of arrows. They fought in disciplined units that moved together on the command of drums and gongs and signal flags. When one group advanced, another covered it. They did not seek glory. They sought to win, by any means, as fast as possible. So Sukekuni and his men died almost to the last. Tsushima fell. Then the island of Iki fell the same way, its defenders overwhelmed, its people slaughtered or enslaved. Survivors who escaped to the mainland carried horror stories that ran ahead of the fleet like a cold wind. The Mongols, they said, took no prisoners they didn't want. They nailed captured women to the sides of their ships. They killed without ceremony, without mercy, without the slightest understanding of honor. And then, on the 19th of November, the fleet reached the wide curve of Hakata Bay on the coast of Kyushu, the gateway to Japan itself. The samurai were waiting on the beach, and they were about to receive the most brutal education in the history of warfare. The Mongols came ashore in their tight, terrifying formations. When the samurai charged forward in the old way, one rider at a time, seeking single combat, the Mongols cut them apart with massed volleys of arrows tipped in what the Japanese believed was poison. Mongol bows could strike from farther away than the samurai had ever experienced. Their units never broke into individual duels. They were a wall, a machine, advancing and firing as one. And then came the weapons that no Japanese warrior had ever seen. The Mongols used bombs, iron and ceramic shells packed with gunpowder, hurled by hand or by catapult, that exploded in the air and on the ground with a flash of fire and a crack of thunder that no one on that beach could comprehend. The Japanese called them tetsuhao. To samurai who had never heard an explosion in their lives, it must have seemed like the gods themselves were hurling lightning. The blasts shredded men and panicked horses. War drums and gongs created a wall of sound designed to terrify, and it worked. By the end of that first day of fighting, the samurai had been pushed back. They had been outranged, out-coordinated, and out-teched at every turn. They were brave. No one who reads these accounts can doubt their courage. But courage alone was being ground down by a war machine that simply did not fight the way they did. The Japanese commanders pulled back from the beach toward a defensive line inland, near an ancient fortification, and prepared for what they assumed would be the final assault in the morning. That night, the samurai of Kyushu lay in the dark and counted their dead and waited to die. The most powerful army on earth was camped on their shore. By every rule of war, Japan was finished. And then, in the black hours before dawn, the wind began to rise. Before we get to that wind, because that wind is the part everyone thinks they know, I want to tell you about a man. Because the most extraordinary thing about these invasions is that we have an eyewitness. Not a legend passed down by storytellers, not a chronicle written by monks a century later. We have the testimony of a samurai who was actually there, who fought in both invasions, and who paid an artist to paint exactly what he saw and did. His name was Takezaki Suenaga. Suenaga was not a great lord. He was a minor samurai from the province of Higo on Kyushu, a man of modest means and enormous ambition, with a grievance against the system. He had been cheated, he felt, out of land and rank that should have been his. And in the warrior society of medieval Japan, there was only one way for a man like him to rise: to perform deeds of such conspicuous, reckless bravery in battle that they could not be ignored, and to be rewarded for them. So when the Mongols came, Takazaki Suenaga saw not just a threat to his homeland, he saw the chance of a lifetime, the chance to make his name immortal. And he very nearly died doing it. In the scrolls he later commissioned, known to history as the Moko Shurai Ekotoba, the illustrated account of the Mongol invasion, we see Suenaga in the thick of it. We see him demanding the right to be first into battle, brushing past more senior men, insisting that he and his handful of retainers be allowed to charge the enemy ahead of everyone else.
His commanders told him to wait for the main force. He refused. Glory delayed was glory denied. He charged. In one of the most famous images ever produced in Japan, we see Takazaki Suenaga on his horse amid the chaos of Hakata Bay. His mount is struck and bleeding. 3 Mongol soldiers stand before him, drawing their bows, and above and beside him, frozen in the painting, is one of those terrible iron bombs, bursting in a black cloud of fire and smoke. Suenaga is wounded. His horse is going down, and still he is driving forward into the arrows, into the blast, alone. He should have died. By his own account, he and his men were thrown from their horses, surrounded, bleeding from multiple wounds. He was saved at the last moment by the arrival of other Japanese riders who pulled the Mongols off him. But think about what the enemy saw. Imagine you are a soldier in Kublai Khan's army. You have conquered half the world. You have broken empires. And on this strange beach, against your arrows and your bombs and your disciplined ranks, a single warrior in pale lacquered armor comes screaming at you, his horse already dying beneath him, his body already pierced, and he does not stop. You fill him with arrows, and he keeps coming. You set off a bomb in his face, and he rides through the smoke. You knock him down, and he gets back up. This was not one man. This was the spirit of an entire warrior class that had been raised from birth on a single idea that death was nothing, and dishonor was everything. The samurai did not fear dying. They feared living as cowards. And an enemy who does not fear death is the most frightening thing a soldier can face, because none of your weapons reach the place where courage lives. The Mongol veterans who survived carried these images home. Warriors who could not be stopped. Warriors who fought past wounds that should have killed them. Warriors who seemed less like men and more like vengeful spirits, Oni, the demons of Japanese legend, given armor and a blade. The samurai demon was not a single person. It was a reputation. It was the dawning realization, in the minds of the most successful conquerors in history, that they had finally sailed into a place where the people would rather die to the last man than ever kneel. And the Mongols, for all their power, were about to learn that you cannot conquer a people like that. You can only kill them. And there were a great many of them left to kill. But before that reckoning could come, before the Mongols could bring their full weight down on the exhausted samurai, the sky decided to intervene. Here is one of the strangest turns in all of military history. On the night after that first brutal day of fighting at Hakata Bay, the Mongol commanders made a decision that historians still debate. Despite having pushed the samurai back, despite holding the upper hand on the beach, they ordered their troops to withdraw from land and return to the ships for the night. Why? We're not entirely certain. Some accounts say the Mongols were low on arrows after a day of furious shooting. Some say a key commander had been wounded. Some say they were simply being cautious, unwilling to be caught on a hostile shore in the dark, and planned to resume the assault and the slaughter at first light from the safety of the sea. Whatever the reason, the entire invasion force climbed back aboard their ships and rode at anchor in the bay through the night. And that night, the wind came.
A great storm rolled in off the sea, a typhoon, the seasonal tropical cyclone that haunts those waters. The Mongol fleet, packed into the bay, had nowhere to go. The ships were thrown against each other and against the rocks, Hulls splintered, masts snapped. Men who had survived every battle from China to Korea were dragged screaming into the black water. By the time the storm passed, an estimated third of the fleet was simply gone, and with it perhaps 13,000 men drowned in a single night. The survivors did the only thing they could. The battered remnant of the great fleet limped back toward Korea, broken, having failed. When the people of Kyushu came down to the shore in the gray light after the storm, they found a sea full of wreckage and bodies. The army that had been about to destroy them had been scattered by the wind itself. To the Japanese, there was only one possible explanation. This was not luck. This was not weather.
This was the gods of Japan reaching down to defend their sacred land. The kami, the divine spirits of the islands, had answered the prayers of the shrines and the temples, where monks and priests had been chanting without pause since the invasion began. They had sent a wind to save their people, a divine wind. In Japanese, Kamikaze. That word, a word that would echo with terrible new meanings 7 centuries later, was born here, on the shores of Kyushu, in the belief that heaven itself had intervened to keep Japan free. But here is what's crucial, and what makes this story so much more than a tale of a lucky storm. The Japanese did not simply thank the gods and go back to sleep. The young regent Hojo Tokimune understood something his enemies underestimated. Kublai Khan was not a man who quit. The Mongols would be back, and next time, the wind might not come. So Japan did something remarkable. It prepared. Tokimune ordered the construction of a defensive wall along the most likely landing beaches of Hakata Bay. A barrier of stone, roughly 2 meters high and stretching for some 20 kilometers along the coast. The clans of Kyushu were each assigned a section to build and to guard. The samurai organized rotating coastal defense duties. They built smaller, faster boats designed to harass the enemy fleet before it could land. They studied what had gone wrong. They learned from the enemy who had nearly destroyed them. For 7 years, Japan watched the sea and built its wall, and waited. And across that sea, Kublai Khan was building too, because the Khan had not forgotten, and the Khan was not finished. The first invasion had been the warning. The second would be the reckoning, and it would be the largest seaborne invasion the world would see for almost 700 years, not surpassed until the beaches of Normandy in 1944. In 1281, the sea filled with ships again. But this time the word fleet hardly does it justice. Kublai Khan, now master of all China, threw the full weight of his empire at Japan. He assembled not one army, but 2. From Korea came the Eastern Route Army, some 900 ships and 40,000 men, following the same path as the first invasion. And from the recently conquered coast of southern China came the Jiangnan Army, a staggering force of perhaps 3,500 ships and 100,000 men or more. Put together, the numbers are almost unbelievable for the medieval world. Around 4,400 ships, somewhere between 70,000 and 140,000 soldiers. 2 enormous fleets that were supposed to meet near Kyushu and crush Japan beneath a single, overwhelming hammer blow. Against this stood roughly 40,000 samurai and defenders. The arithmetic was, again, a nightmare for Japan. But this time, Japan was ready. The Eastern Route Army arrived first, impatient, sailing ahead of the southern fleet to grab glory before the others could share it. Once again, they took the stepping stone islands of Tsushima and Iki with brutal efficiency. And once again, they sailed into Hakata Bay expecting to wade ashore. But the beach they remembered was gone. In its place stood the wall. The stone barrier did exactly what it was built to do. The Mongol cavalry, the terror of the Eurasian continent, could not simply storm up the beach and deploy. There was no open ground to land horses and form their devastating units. The wall channeled them, slowed them, broke up their formations, and turned the shoreline into a killing zone that the samurai had spent 7 years learning to defend. And the samurai had changed. These were not the men of 1,274, charging one at a time into massed arrows out of misplaced notions of single combat. They had absorbed the brutal lessons of the first invasion. Now they fought in coordinated groups. They held the wall. And at night, they went on the attack in a way the Mongols never expected. The samurai had built small, fast boats, and under cover of darkness, they rowed out to the anchored Mongol ships in raiding parties. They slipped aboard in the black of night, killed the crews in vicious close-quarters fighting, where Mongol bombs and arrows were useless, set fires, and vanished back into the dark before the alarm could be raised. Takazaki Suenaga himself, older now but no less hungry for glory, was part of these raids, climbing onto enemy vessels and taking heads, all of it recorded in his scrolls. There was no rest. There was no safety even on the water. The invaders had crossed the sea to besiege Japan, and instead, Japan was besieging them. Night after night, the raids continued. The great Mongol fleet, unable to land its army, unable to rest, bled in the bay. The Mongols were forced to chain their ships together for mutual defense against the raiders, lashing the great fleet into a single connected mass, decking them over with planks so men could move between them and repel the boarding parties. Tying their ships together, remember that, because it was about to become the worst decision they ever made. For weeks, the stalemate held. The Eastern Route Army could not break through. They pulled back to the island of Iki to wait for the massive Southern fleet, sickness spreading through their ranks, morale rotting in the summer heat. When the Jiangnan army finally arrived and the two forces began to combine near the coast in August, the full horror of their numbers gathered once more off the shore of Japan. The final assault was about to begin. 100,000 men and more, preparing to overwhelm the exhausted defenders at last. And then, on the 15th of August, 1281, the sky turned the color of a bruise, and the wind began to rise a second time. It came out of the southwest, and it came with a fury that dwarfed the storm of 7 years before. A massive typhoon roared across the waters off Kyushu and slammed directly into the combined Mongol fleet. The largest concentration of ships in the world packed into the waters near the coast, many of them chained together exactly as the samurai raids had forced them to be. That decision now became a death sentence. Ships lashed to one another could not ride out the storm independently. As the waves rose into mountains and the wind screamed, the chained vessels smashed into each other, dragging one another down. The cheaply and hastily built ships of the Chinese fleet, many of them flat-bottomed riverboats never meant for open ocean, thrown together under impossible deadlines by conquered laborers who had no reason to build them well, came apart in the water. The destruction was almost total. Contemporary accounts and modern estimates suggest that at least half of the Mongol force perished, by some accounts far more.
Tens of thousands of men drowned in a matter of hours. The sea, it was said, was so thick with wreckage and bodies that a person could almost walk across Hakata Bay on the broken timbers of the greatest fleet ever assembled. The few thousand survivors who made it ashore were hunted down by the samurai. Those who were captured faced no mercy. The long, bitter memory of Tsushima and Iki saw to that.
The commanders abandoned their own drowning men, taking the seaworthy ships that remained and fleeing back toward the mainland, leaving tens of thousands of soldiers stranded on the shore and the sinking wrecks to their fate. The second invasion, the largest the world would know until the 20th century, was annihilated. And once again, the Japanese looked at the wreckage-choked sea and knew, with absolute certainty, what had happened. The kami had answered. Twice now, at the exact moment of greatest danger, the divine wind had come to scatter the enemies of the sacred islands. 2 invasions, 2 storms. It could not be coincidence. It could only be destiny. The Kamikaze had saved Japan a second time, and this time the lesson would sink so deep into the Japanese soul that it would still be shaping the nation's view of itself 700 years later. Kublai Khan, raging, planned a third invasion. He ordered new ships built, but the cost had been catastrophic. His empire was stretched thin by rebellions and other wars, and resistance grew among his exhausted subjects. The third invasion was delayed, and delayed again, and after Kublai's death in 1294, it was quietly abandoned forever. Japan had done what no one else had managed to do. It had faced the Mongol Empire at the height of its power, twice, and survived. Not conquered, not subdued, free. So what actually happened on those beaches? Was it really the gods? This is where the story gets even more interesting, because the answer historians give today is more complex, and in some ways more remarkable, than the legend. The storms were real. There is no serious doubt that typhoons struck both fleets at catastrophic moments. Japan sits in a region lashed by tropical cyclones every late summer and autumn, and a fleet caught in a bay during typhoon season was in genuine, mortal danger. Marine archaeologists have actually found the wrecks of Kublai's fleet on the seabed off Japan, and what they discovered supports the accounts. Many of the ships were poorly constructed, hastily built, some of them river vessels, never meant for the open sea, assembled under crushing deadlines by conquered Korean and Chinese laborers. Ships like that, chained together in a storm, were doomed. But here is the part the legend leaves out. The wind did not act alone. The storm of 1281 only destroyed the Mongols because the samurai had already trapped them on the water. For weeks, the Japanese defense, the Great Stone Wall, the disciplined fighting at the shoreline, the relentless night raids that forced the enemy to chain their ships together, had prevented the Mongols from ever establishing a foothold on land. If the invaders had been allowed to come ashore and seize a base, they could have ridden out the typhoon on solid ground. It was Japanese resistance that kept them bottled up at sea, exactly where the storm could destroy them. In other words, the gods may have sent the wind, but the samurai built the trap. The courage of men like Takazaki Suenaga, the cold, strategic patience of the young regent Hojo Tokimune, the 7 years of preparation, the wall, the raids, the hard-won tactical lessons, all of it set the stage. The storm was the final blow, but it landed on an enemy that Japan had already fought to a standstill. And yet, and this is the tragedy hidden inside the triumph, the legend that took hold was not,
We saved ourselves. The legend that took hold was, the gods saved us. The Japanese had prayed to their shrines and temples throughout both invasions, and when the wind came, the religious establishment claimed the credit.
The idea took root and grew into something close to a national religion. The belief that Japan was a divine land, Shinkoku, protected by the gods, uniquely chosen, fundamentally unconquerable. A nation that, when truly threatened, would always be saved by heaven itself. It's a beautiful idea. It's also a dangerous one. Because a nation that believes it cannot lose is a nation that may one day forget how to ask whether it should fight at all. And there was a darker cost, too, one the legend completely erased. The samurai who actually won the war, men like Suenaga, were never properly rewarded. In all their previous wars, samurai earned land and riches taken from the defeated enemy. But you cannot divide up a drowned army. There was no conquered territory, no enemy estates to hand out. The Hojo shogunate had bankrupted itself defending the country and had nothing to give the warriors who had bled for it. Resentment festered among the samurai class for decades. The very victory that saved Japan helped, in time, to bring down the government that had won it. Triumph and ruin tangled together, as they so often are. But that idea of the divine wind, the Kamikaze, the conviction that Japan was a sacred land that heaven would never let fall, that idea did not die with the Mongols. It went to sleep for 700 years, and then, in the 20th century, it woke up. Fast forward to 1944. Japan is once again facing an enemy fleet of overwhelming size, but this time, the ships belong to the United States, and they are winning. The empire that had conquered much of the Pacific is being driven back, island by island, toward the home islands themselves. And in the desperation of those final months, the Japanese military reached back across 7 centuries and pulled out the most powerful symbol in the nation's memory. They named their squadrons of suicide pilots, young men who flew their planes directly into Allied ships, the Kamikaze. The divine wind. The same name, the same idea. That one more time, at the moment of greatest danger, a divine sacrifice could scatter the enemy fleet and save the sacred land, just as the typhoons had scattered the Mongols. This time, no wind came. The legend that had been born as a story of survival ended as a story of tragedy. Tens of thousands of young lives spent chasing a miracle that belonged to a different age. The Kamikaze of 1944 is the dark mirror of the Kamikaze of 1281, proof of how a powerful story carried across centuries can save a nation once and help destroy it the next time. And that is exactly why this 800-year-old story matters right now, today. Because we are still living in a world shaped by the questions those beaches raised. Look around. We still watch great powers test whether smaller nations will kneel or resist. We still see the conviction that overwhelming force must inevitably win. And we still see that conviction proven wrong by defenders who refuse to break, who turn their own geography into a weapon, who make an invasion so costly that the invader's strength becomes a trap. Military analysts today study how a smaller, determined defender can stalemate a vastly larger force by denying it a foothold, by raiding its supply lines,
by refusing to fight on the enemy's terms. The samurai understood that in 1281. Nations are relearning it on battlefields in our own time, and we still tell ourselves national myths, stories that we are chosen, protected, exceptional, destined to win. Those stories can give a people the courage to stand against impossible odds, the way they steeled the samurai on that wall. And those same stories can blind a people to reality, the way they blinded an empire into sending boys to die in 1944.
The line between the inspiring myth and the fatal one is razor thin, and every generation has to learn where it lies, usually the hard way. That is the real legacy of the day the Mongols met the samurai demon. Not just a storm, not just a battle. A lesson about courage and delusion, about resistance and sacrifice, about the stories nations tell to survive, and the price they pay when those stories outlive the truth. The most powerful empire in human history sailed against a small chain of islands, twice, and twice it was broken. By the wind, yes, but also by men who would rather die on a beach than live on their knees. The Mongols sailed home with a story about a demon in pale armor who would not fall. But the demon was never one warrior. The demon was a whole people who decided that some things are worth more than survival. And 800 years later, in a world still full of beaches where the strong test the will of the few, that is a truth worth remembering. If this story gripped you, do me a favor, and it costs you nothing. Hit that like button, because it genuinely helps this channel reach more people who love history told this way. Subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss the next one. And tell me in the comments, do you think it was really the divine wind that saved Japan? Or the courage of the samurai who trapped the enemy on the water? I read every comment, and I want to know what you believe. Stay curious. I'll see you in the next one.